And welcome to the fourth Virtual Connection and Development Series. As you all know, we are here with Dr. Sandy Shulman, who will be sharing with us a little bit more about consultation in psychology. So as a lot of folks already know, but just to reiterate, the Virtual Connection and Development Series was developed by members of the Division 17 Early Career Professionals Committee for the purposes of presenting timely and relevant networking and professional development opportunities for early career professionals. The webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes and will address a broad range of topics associated with consultation within the field of psychology. Topics addressed will include identifying your niche, establishing yourself as a consultant, and practical and ethical considerations for engaging in consultation. This webinar is best suited for students and ECPs who are considering incorporating consultation as part of their professional role. The webinar will begin with Dr. Shulman, our presenter, discussing her experiences and lessons learned establishing and growing a consultation practice. We'll then transition to a moderated question and answer section based on questions generated from students and ECPs prior to the webinar. And then we'll conclude with time for questions from members of our audience. So if you, as an audience member, have questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box. So if you look at the bottom of the Zoom meeting, there's an option to kind of type, if you click on the Q&A button and kind of type the responses there, we will also have time to answer those questions. So yeah, we look forward to hearing from Dr. Shulman, who is a partner and partner of the Executive Development Group, internationally known in leadership assessment and development, and she currently manages large, long-term global organizational client engagements, focusing on executive education and coaching, strategic leadership development, and organizational diversity initiatives. She is a senior lecturer for the HEC School of Business in Paris, Shanghai, Beijing, and Qatar, and part of the Duke University Global Learning Network faculty. So now that we've kind of set the frame, we'd like to transition to having Dr. Shulman share her experiences and lessons learned in establishing a consultation practice.
Hi, everybody. I've been asked to start off and say kind of how I got to where I am right now. Not because anybody will follow my exact path, but I think there might be some principles that you can extrapolate out of this in terms of my journey. And also, I want to share a few lessons that I have learned along the way. Somebody asked me before we started this seminar about, or mentioned the fact that probably many ECPs and students feel unprepared to go into a career of consulting. And my point would be, at this point, I'm pretty far along in my career, and I still never feel fully prepared for consulting. So I think there's a humility that goes with being in a learning mode about this all the time, that you'll never feel fully prepared, but you might feel more prepared than you do today. So let me say that, and let me explain a little bit about how I got into the consulting role. Like all of you, there is some consultation built in likely into your internship experiences, or many of you may have built into your practicum experiences and your training programs. I think one of the things that I had an advantage about is that when I came into my PhD program in counseling psychology, I actually had worked in a professional job before I got there. I worked in a men's prison, and I had worked as a director of a very large dormitory with almost 2,000 students, and I had worked as assistant dean of students at The Ohio State University, responsible for both developing programs and for running existing programs. So I came in with some sense of what a work role would be in the context of a couple of different institutions. And at least at that point in my career as a graduate student, I did understand the difference between the context of a prison and the context of a university. So that at least gave me a range of things to think about in terms of context. I would tell you right now that I was always interested in context, because many people ask me, why did you become a counseling psychologist? You could have been an IO person, you could have been something else. And I always fundamentally was interested in people's effectiveness and development. And I was always interested in that in context. And what happened to me when I trained in counseling psychology is that, and I think we do a better job today talking about context than we did 100 years ago. But we still today, we talk about context sometimes more from a cultural or multicultural perspective, sometimes some of the social and demographic variables. But people work, live, play in specific environments that have all of those components and specific components of those environments. So the thought when I was doing counseling of people coming in one by one, and I was helping them deal with a variety of issues, I was always curious about the context. What was the environment doing that was creating various pressures to respond in certain ways? And that could be the environment of the workplace, it could be the environment of their home environment, it could have been the environment of their upbringing. And I often felt at times that if I had 15 minutes to see the context they were in, I would be much better able to be of help to them as individuals. So that was my original perspective. I was always interested in that. I was also always interested in systems, because it occurred to me at some point that if I were doing work one by one by one, I was missing all of the effects of institutions and organizations that were creating certain amounts of the variance in behavior in people's lives. And so it seemed to me that being able to consult at both a group and an organizational level, as well as working with individuals in context, was really, really important. So I had a systems perspective, a real emphasis on context, and a real desire. I like to solve problems. And I would tell you here that probably the most basic definition of consulting is really to apply, in this case, psychological consulting is to apply psychological knowledge to advise others to solve problems or enhance performance or do something at either an individual or a group or an organizational level. And so what happened to me then is that I was interested in this, but of course there was no place in the curriculum for organizational consulting very much. There probably isn't any more room now than there was then, in fact, probably less. But I was able, through practica and through my internship, which I did at the Ohio State University Counseling Center, to try to get some experiences, because I knew the Ohio State campus well, and it was a familiar local environment because I had been an assistant dean. I was able to create some opportunities for consultation and ask some of my supervisors if they would help me do that, because they would be things around programs, they'd be things around teams, they would be things around groups. I asked for that, and at the same time I really worked hard to get some special opportunities to work with some of the faculty in the IO program at Ohio State at that time, which had one of the best IO programs in the country at that point in time. I was very fortunate. So I tried very hard. I knew what I was kind of interested in, but I still also had all of the regular work that everybody else had. So what happened is basically then I developed this real interest, and at that time there was a place called, and still is called, the Center for Creative Leadership, which is kind of a private institution. It's kind of a cross between a think tank and a very large consulting organization in Greensboro, North Carolina. And every year at the time when I was in graduate school, they would give fellowships, summer fellowships, to the top 15 or 20 IO students in the country. Well, my program really didn't know what to do with me. And, but I had gravitated toward people like Sam Ossipow, who was involved in vocational psychology, Bruce Walsh, who was teaching person-environment interaction. So I was trying to get as much of the contextual piece as I could out of the existing faculty we had. Sam Ossipow happened to rotate into the chair of the psych department. And so one year he said to me, Sandy, he said, we have this fellowship at this place called the Center for Creative Leadership that was run by David Campbell of the Strong Campbell Interest Inventory fame. He said, do you think you would be interested if we put your name in to see whether David Campbell would take somebody that wasn't an IO student in this program? And I said, well, I was interested, and I didn't know what it would mean. And lo and behold, everybody said yes, and I went off to the Center for Creative Leadership for the summer. And what happened in a very interesting way, the people that were there were brilliant. They are brilliant IO people. To this day, many of them are brilliant IO people in the field. And IO has a very pointed perspective on organizations and assessment for performance, evaluation of performance, those kinds of things, intervention for organizational performance. But we were given, as part of our fellowship, we had to intern somewhere. And we were all based in Minneapolis at the time. And so we all were assigned to organizations in Minneapolis. And what happened is, after I came home from my assignment the first day, I had the Minneapolis State Patrol as my organization. But we had people in Pillsbury, we had people in General Mills, we had people in various manufacturing organizations, we had people everywhere. And they came back the first day, and what most of the people could not do was enter the organization. And I don't mean that lightly. They really didn't know how to come into an organization, establish their role, establish what they were there to do. They knew how to do the work once they got there, but they didn't know how to create the situation interpersonally to make that happen. So I started a crash course on how to enter an organization, how to do an initial interview, how to do those things. And I coached my colleagues at night. And the center staff watched this. And at the end of the summer institute, they offered me a job. They said, if you could do that on the spot, you could probably figure out what to do. So I was quite enthralled. I had some other job opportunities at that point in time. But I decided that I would come to the Center for Creative Leadership sight unseen and see what happened. And I was very fortunate, because what happened then is, for the next probably 5 or 6 years, I believe I got the equivalent of another and an interdisciplinary PhD on leadership and organizational development, because I worked in multidisciplinary teams of social psychologists, business people, corporate leaders, military leaders, all sorts of people working on issues around leadership, performance, organizational development, et cetera. I was very, very fortunate to have that experience. That's where I started. And then, I really enjoyed the problem solving piece of that. So I left the center and joined a private firm, very small firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, that specialized in actually labor relations issues. And so I got a lot of the hardcore management labor background about things, but I was still focusing on the notion of individual development in a specific context. If you really look at IO, that's not exactly what IO does. And what I do today is not exactly what most counseling psychologists do. I was at an intersection point. I wasn't an IO person. I wasn't totally a counseling psych person. I kept my home division always as Division 17, and I always have. Somewhere along the way here, we proposed writing an issue about organizational, what we've come to call organizational counseling psychology. And at the time, there had been an issue about counseling psychologists working in organizations, I believe in 1982, there was one. And by about 1988 or 89, we put together a proposal to do one. And someone said, well, we don't really need that. We've done one. Didn't we do one in the last 10 years? As if that's all that you needed to know to be a consultant in business organizations. So I wasn't really getting, I'm trying to say this in a delicate way, I got less than the kind of support you would hope to get for the kind of functions that we were putting forth. So there were other like-minded souls like myself. So, I did this consulting labor relations for a while, but I was also still really interested. I still had connections with people that were in counseling psych in more traditional roles of counseling, vocational psychology, which was very helpful, all of that. And so for personal reasons, came back to Ohio And myself and 3 other colleagues formed at that time what we just were calling a group practice, which was going to be individual psychological counseling, things like that. But we also found out in doing this, and I also at that time then took a role as an academic at Kent State University. And when I got there, you have to remember that that part of the world was where a lot of organizational development came from. Case Western Cleveland is the home of OD. So when they found out I was coming, they actually gave me an opportunity to teach some courses in the College of Education around organizational development, intervention, psychology, and organizational settings. So I actually had an opportunity to use some of my skills. And so I was simultaneously building this group practice, and then I was also working in this academic program. So the 2 things that came out of that were really, I think, important issues was the group practice turned into individual work, group, and traditional, what I call private practice work. We got into the employee assistance program business, and we landed up with a very large practice. We started creating contracts with organizations, and before we knew it, we had contracts with the 55 largest organizations in Columbus, Ohio, covering about 110,000 lives. And the process of a good EAP program is on the front end, you are doing triage and consultation. And sometimes you refer individuals for treatment, but many times what you identify are organizational issues and themes that are coming from employees. And that gave me another opportunity to go in and work with organizations. And we actually organized our practice so that we had 1 person in charge of individual issues and 1 person in charge of organizational issues, so that we could protect the firewall of confidentiality for individuals. But the themes would get fed to the organization. We could help the organizations work on things. Simultaneously, in my academic job, Louise Fitzgerald and I were designing what turned out to be the first national study on sexual harassment in academia and the workplace. So it was a great opportunity because I was in workplaces, we could collect data outside of, just our own academic setting. So we collected it nationally. And so the notion of hostile environment, sexual harassment became an area where I had some passion and a specialty that I could also take back to organizations. So it grew from there. I went from a very local practice, doing more work now nationally because of the sexual harassment piece, and regionally. And we worked on this in this large behavioral health care practice, where we then had a consultation unit, which I ran for 17 years. And we actually then had a very interesting setup where we had an individual practice people could come to, individuals, families, groups, an EAP practice that was there, and also then pure organizational practice. And some of our clients entered from any part of those systems. And I always stayed more I did some individual therapy, but I always stayed on the part of the organizational side. That was where I was most interested in leadership, because I'd come out of the Center for Creative Leadership. So after about 17 years, we got too big to be a private practice and too small to compete with the healthcare systems. We were too far ahead of our time to be in an integrated care situation. So we sold our practice to a healthcare organization, and the organizational consultation part we kept. I stayed regional for another few years, and then in about 2000, I joined former colleagues from the Center for Creative Leadership in a private firm that we created ourselves for organizational consultation. Right now, I've been doing this for the last 15 to 20 years. We went global during that period of time because organizations went global. It wasn't that we purposely went global. We went with the trends. So many of the corporations we were working with started establishing things in other countries. So we went with that. We also used and were asked to be affiliated with business schools who were looking for people that knew something about human behavior to teach the behavioral aspects of psychology and behavior to business people. And so I was offered the opportunity, and that's why I've been affiliated with Duke, with UNC Chapel Hill. HEC, which is the HEC that you see in the introduction, is the major business school in France. And so through those, then we got to teach people in organizations. Then those organizations ask you to come in and do things. So it becomes a very reciprocal situation to do things. What I would tell you when you ask me really what I think consulting is that I believe that I get to do almost a different job every day and look like I'm working steadily. What has sustained me through all of this is a passion for systems, a passion for context, a passion for helping people in specific contexts get better at what they're doing, solve a challenge that seems unsolvable, helping groups of people mobilize and work well together in a diverse environment. Those are the things that have driven me for a long time. I'm going to stop right there and ask my colleague Allie how we're doing, so I don't spend too much time talking here. Does that kind of cover a good intro about where we're going, Allie?
I think that's beautiful. Thank you for everything that you've shared. I know, so we could certainly transition, because I think it's a beautiful intro because it gives us a really good sense of both like how you use your training, so how you use the counseling psychology training, but also how you got some kind of specialized support in the particular kind of consultation piece, as well as kind of how that's evolved, how the position has actually evolved over time for you. So I appreciate you kind of giving that description. I know you also mentioned that you have some lessons learned, so it's up to you. If you would like to share some of those, we can certainly do that now. I'm also open to, if you would prefer to go through some of the questions that folks have asked, I'll leave that up to you.
I'd like to share a few of those lessons because they follow directly from what I just talked about.
Perfect.
And again, these have worked for me. Some of you might say, but Sandy, you don't understand my current context, and I will be happy to hear your context and see what we can do about that. So my lessons are the following. First of all, I always followed my passions and my interests rather than the money. The most insulting thing that people probably have said to me in my consulting world is, oh, the money must be really good and you're following the money. And I've said to people, if I really wanted to be rich, if that was the goal in life, I would have, first of all, stayed in mathematics and logic, which I started with, and gone into technology, and I would have had a foundation by now probably. And that's, so if I really wanted to be rich, I'd be a lot richer. It was never about the money. It was about pursuing my interests. And in doing that, there were many times when, in order to get into systems, when we were first working on early consultations, first of all, the ones in the university were free when I was doing them in a consultation in a counseling center context. When we were opening up our group practice and doing those things, many of the consultations that we did, or many of the kind of programs we did to try to establish expertise in the community, we did for free. We did them in churches. We did them at brown bag lunches with organizations. We did a lot of things for very, very minimal, if no fees at all, in order to have the experience of following something that was of interest. And I may sound a little bit like a Pollyanna here, but I have always found when I've pursued my interest, I could find work, instead of looking at the work and seeing which, if I can make myself fit. I mean, this is a adaptation fit, trying to make your own path. And I really felt that I could always find some within reason. Now, you can always do a couple different things at the same time, and you can start a consultation practice while you're still doing therapy, so you don't have to be homeless in order to figure this out. I'm not talking about being unwise about it, but I really believe that you need to follow your passion. The second thing I would say is, I don't think that, or particularly organizational and team consultation, I don't believe it's a solo sport. So finding like-minded souls, whether it's getting an apprenticeship in an organization, getting a fellowship like I did, or just finding like-minded colleagues in your community who are interested in doing that. Maybe other ECPs, because it's hard sometimes to get consultants to want to mentor you, because you are potentially, for some people, consider it competition, ironically. That's the way, unfortunately, the way it works. But you have like-minded souls that are trying to do things. Find some people that you can talk things over with. I think that's really important. The other thing I've always done is try to also periodically partner with people in other disciplines from mine. Because what I learned from my Center for Creative Leadership experience is that business people or military people or other kinds of psychologists look at organizations and people in them and systems and groups very differently than the models that we have in psychology, and they may come up with the same conclusion but with a whole different way of thinking about it, or they may come up with a very different alternative hypothesis that really is worth considering, and maybe it changes the way I think about things. So I would add that. The third thing I would say is that if you really are going to get into the group and organizational part of consultation, as opposed to, more like coaching as an individual or working with individuals in organizations of some kind, that I believe is harder to combine with things like full-time practice. The pace of working with teams and organizations is very different than I found the pace of working with individuals in a 45, 30 or 45 or 60-minute context. And so the whole pace of how organizations engage you is very different. So I think figuring out how to balance that out is an important issue. The other thing that I learned that they always tell you in consulting, but it's really, really true, is the first question you always have to keep in the back of your mind when you're doing consultation is, who is the client? You have an individual you might be working with. You could have them embedded in a team that you might also be working with. In an organization you might also be working with who has a group of shareholders or a board of directors that might be running things, and being very careful about knowing who the engagement is for then dictates how information is shared, what information is shared, who your major responsibilities are, where your potential conflicts of interest are. All of that comes from always asking that question. And at least in individual counseling, I didn't have as much trouble trying to figure out usually who the client was. It was either the person or the couple or the family that was in the room. So it's a much more complicated situation. The other lesson I would say is that you have to think carefully about what you think the consultant's role is. You can come in as an expert. For example, initially when I came in for sexual harassment consultation, I was the expert. I knew as much about it as there was because it was our research. I had worked with teams of lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't stay in a Holiday Inn, so I didn't try to give legal advice, but I knew enough about certain areas of the law to be able to recommend that they get consultations other than the one I'm giving. But it was an expert model. In some of the situations I was in, I was a trainer or an educator. So many of the things that you learn to do or you are already doing in your classrooms, for example, you could turn that into working in other organizations as long as you remember that they are no longer students, that they are colleagues. They are grown people that are doing grown work, whatever they might be doing. Most of the time, I consider myself a collaborator. I come in and I will say to an organization, you know your organization, you know the economics of your organization, you understand the business strategy, your marketplace, your competition, whatever. What I understand is human behavior. Now, you explain to me what you're trying to do and how you're organized and whatever the consultation is, then I can figure out how to apply what I know about human behavior and psychology to that situation to get either maximum performance, satisfaction, high motivation, change process. All of that is simply getting human behavior going in a positive direction for some specific purpose. I never worry about, trying to explain what the, 812 certificates or degrees are that you're supposed to have. They understand. I come in as a psychologist. I say I'm a doctor of behavior. And that may fit some of you more than others. And you're the doctor of your business. And that's all you need to know. And I think what I do is I focus on what I'm bringing to the client situation, not what my credentials are. And that seems to work really well. I'm not hiding from them, but I don't need them. I need to bring the knowledge or the skills or the questions or whatever I have. The other thing I want to say, and I will close on this one because I think this is really important. If you are going to consult with people outside of the context of the client room you're in now, this is just as true for them as well. But you have to respect your clients. So for example, if you think business is a terrible for-profit business, for example, is a terrible thing and they've got all sorts of ulterior motives, or you think everyone in business is out only for money, which I don't believe is true, you can't really respect your organizational client. If you can't respect your client, I don't think you should be working with them. You don't have to like everything they do. You don't have to agree with everything they do. And I've walked away from engagements on a values basis, but I fundamentally respect the right of organizations, businesses, not-for-profit organizations to exist, to try to run their organizations or teams or the individuals to do the best that they can in those environments. And I believe that you have to have that fundamental respect in order to be a good consultant. So let me stop there. And maybe we're ready for some questions. I seem to be sliding off my chair here. All right, I'm going to hop up here and slide back on my chair.
It's a great energy. I love it. Thank you for describing all those lessons. Yeah, I appreciate it. Even I think something that's standing out for me is even just thinking about the different kind of roles that you can have as a consultant. I hadn't kind of conceptualized that in my head until you showed that out loud. So, yeah. And thinking about the different ways that you can relate to the people that you're consulting with. So thank you for all of that. And I'm going to kind of shout out some of the, so thank you to either ECPs, students, people who are on this call right now, maybe not on this call right now, who offered questions in advance of this webinar. So that's actually where we're going to transition now. So we can begin to kind of dig into some of the logistics now that we have a sense of like an example of a person who has successfully stepped into this role. So the first one is, how did you become involved in consulting work, which I think you've already fully answered. Is there anything that you want to share that you haven't already shared, or do you want me to transition to the next one?
We can save that for greatest failures later if you'd like to do that, Ali. You could go into the next. Yeah, I think they've heard enough about my story here. I'm kind of.
Yeah, I don't know if this next one will actually get into greatest failures, but the next question is, what do you wish you had known about consulting work early on, like when you first kind of entered this work?
Well, I'm going to bet that it's the same issue that many of you have now, is how to walk in when you don't know what you're really going to be facing. And at the time, earlier in my career, not recognizing myself as I never thought of myself as a hotshot consultant. I thought of myself as a psychologist doing consulting. Mm-hmm. And so I wish I had known more up front about, I knew how to enter an organization. I know how to talk with people and find out what's on their mind. I know how to figure out what the big questions are that are bothering them. I know how to collect information, etc. But entering the organization and knowing, first of all, recognizing that I had as much right to be there as any other consultant within a range, that I knew enough to be helpful, and I knew enough to know when I didn't know so I could find someone else that could be helpful. So recognizing that I could be there and not feeling like I was in a chronic state of, what am I doing here? That probably, if I could have learned that lesson a little bit earlier, that I didn't have to know everything in order to be effective. That my biggest fear was they were going to find out I didn't know the answer to some question, was not going to finish my career. Trust me, there's a lot of times that I don't know the answer to many questions that clients ask. Recognizing that, and then that whole upfront process of contracting for your value, because on a per engagement basis, it's not like a regular job you go to every day, or even like your therapy practice where you have a fixed set of fees and then it goes. In this situation, you have to sometimes define the scope of work, tell the client what you think you can do, and then place monetary value on it and staff it yourself. I wish I had known more about how to do that earlier. I probably undersold myself in a number of situations, probably worried way too much about what I couldn't do as opposed to what I could do. And the thing that saved me in those situations, however, is that I was always in contact with a network of people that could help me learn as I was going through. I've always seen my career as ongoing learning. And once I'm in that mindset, then I can go back and pick up some lessons that maybe I could have learned faster, but at least I learned them over time.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful to hear. And actually, there are two different pieces that you spoke to that I think actually branch into two different questions. We'll go one at a time. But one of them is, you shared a little bit your process of kind of how you prepared yourself for this work. But some folks were wondering about kind of what types of graduate level experiences should maybe students be thinking about pursuing if they're interested in this work. And even beyond coursework, are there other, I don't know if recommendations is too strong of a word, but other experiences that you would encourage people to kind of seek out if they want to prepare themselves for either a career in or even like a kind of separate kind of side job as a consultant?
Yeah, I can comment that there. There are a number of ways to go about doing this. First of all, you have to figure out what pieces of things do you need more work in. For example, if you're thinking you want to do things globally, well, even if you're going to do things nationally here, for example, getting as much multicultural experience as you can is an absolutely critical issue. And that's an underpinning for anything you do here today from my perspective. So a lot of the emphasis in our programs now on multicultural and international multicultural as well, not just domestic multicultural work, but international work. Diversity and inclusion is really critical. Beyond that, yes, I think many of the things, the experiences you would typically get postgraduate. I think depending on the school you're in, you ought to see what else is in the rest of your psych department. And some of you may be affiliated with institutions that have fine either consulting psychology capabilities. There are some consulting psychology degree programs, not that many, but there certainly are IO programs. Some organizations have organizational development pieces. Some of the business schools that you're affiliated with, if you're in an institution, they also have individual courses that might be really helpful. I mean, it's interesting to me that right now I teach for 3 different business schools.
Sure. Yeah.
So you could be involved in some of those, and many of those schools offer what we would call public programs. Free enrollment, you can go for a particular course or an issue or something like that. Another thing is that many of the kind of skills in consultation you can get from a couple of the divisions in psychology. Division 13, which is consulting psychology, is a division that actually is about almost half of consulting psychology. Division 13 are people that have had some counseling psychology training. And a lot of Division 13, if I'm going to make a contrast with 14, which is industrial organizational, a lot of Division 13 people do a lot of what I would call either process work or individual coaching work. So individual coaching in a context of a counseling psychology degree is pretty easy to make the shift that you're not working on someone's mental health per se. You might be helping them enhance performance at work. You might be helping them develop a new family related skill or something like that. You might be, the people in sports psychology, for example, do a lot of consulting with athletes to help them perform better or to motivate them in a different way or whatever. So that's all potential consulting kinds of roles. So I would say if you're interested in individual coaching, that division offers all sorts of standalone and ongoing program series that would help you with that. Industrial organizational psychology is a very, very large division with all sorts of components now that do include coaching, but they do systems, groups, teams. They have series of ongoing continuing education programs. They have an excellence series, a leadership excellence series every year. One time a year, every fall, they focus on one issue in industrial organizational psychology and concentrate on it for a couple of days and bring in the best people in that field. One time it was executive coaching. The next time it might be performance feedback. Sometimes it might be how to motivate people in organizations. So if you're interested in those kind of things, that would be a great way to go. There are standalone, if you look, there are many standalone certificates, postgraduate experiences you can find if there's a particular area of interest. For example, if you're interested in consultation in a healthcare context, there are many institutes. You can talk with people who are in healthcare systems that can tell you how or where they get their consultants from or how they train their consultants. If that's what you're interested in, which would be a logical extension. I think you have to find one of two things. You have to have a passion for either a context or a passion for a type of role.
Yeah.
You know, if you might be either in your interest, you're really passionate about healthcare, or you're passionate about teams, or you're passionate about a topic, like I was passionate about sexual harassment in hostile environments. If you follow that passion, you'll find the like-minded souls and the people that train in those like-minded areas. So I have mentored a number of ECPs and APA around finding the right person or persons to link up in, usually in either Division 13 or 14. We have people in human factors at APA that are, I know one person at APA that's trying to design safer cars and looking at how human beings react in emergencies to try to figure out what the emergency pieces ought to be on vehicles. The training was not in human factors, but it very clearly was very relevant. So, you know, there are a lot of different ways. There are certainly books that I can recommend. One basic book is a book on organizational or consulting psychology in organizations by Rodney Lowman, Lowman, which was published, I believe, in the end of 2016. That really takes you through all the roles of consultants in organizations, and it puts a lot of the existing literature in there. That's a great way to deal with that. The other resource I would recommend is there are principles that you can get on the APA website for education and training at the doctoral and postdoctoral level in consulting psychology, and you can look at those skill sets, do your own self-analysis of what skill sets you already have, because the training guidelines say very clearly that they recognize you don't have to be an organizational consultant or consulting psychologist to acquire these skills. And so you could go through and do a checklist and say, well, I really need some healthcare consultation experience. How do I work with healthcare teams? You tell me that, I can tell you some place or someone in the country that probably could help you learn those skills. And so that's why having an idea of a passion or an interest or an area you want to be in is the best way to lead, because then it organizes your learning journey, at least your initial one. You can branch from there in all sorts of places, but that's one way to do it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And actually also addresses another question. Some folks were interested in specific resources. So I appreciate you both pointing to like books that have been helpful, but also a website that kind of describes additional resources too. The other piece that you spoke to when you were talking a little bit about like what you wish you had known kind of early on was a little bit of the business model piece. And I think as psychologists, that's the thing that we probably have, at least for a lot of us, have the least experience with. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about kind of the business model of psychology consulting, what that looks like, different considerations, kind of how to start that piece.
All right. I should have added one other obvious way to get consulting experiences to join one of these bigger firms that often hire psychologists for 2 to 3 year periods, where you come in and they train you in, quote, their method of doing things, their method of assessment, their method of implementation, their method of evaluation. And what that does is it gives you one discipline of how to go into an organization and do various things, and then you can build upon that. That would be another way if you really decided you wanted to, learn. And there are all sorts of larger organization consulting firms that do that. Some, RHR, for example, specializes in hiring psychologists to do that kind of work. Korn Ferry hires psychologists to do all sorts of organizational work, and it can be not-for-profits, for-profits. They do all sorts of kinds of work, and I neglected to mention that. The other thing I want to mention before I do get to the business model is the other thing that I should have said, which is an obvious to me but may not be obvious to other people, that I probably wish I was better prepared for when I went into consulting, was that everything about you is part of what you are both selling and being accepted by in a consulting engagement. So all of the issues around whether or not you are competent, whether or not you are accepted in the organization, whether or not you fit, all of the issues around bias, isms, all of the issues around gender, race, multiculturalism, I actually probably had to work on them a lot more on my own than I think we do now, because I'm hoping we do more conscious preparation of our PhDs to go out and recognize those things in both themselves and in others. That was something. The only thing that really saved me is my childhood background, which I won't get into, but it was diverse in a number of ways, and my prison experience, which was very, very helpful in recognizing that not everybody was going to warmly receive me and be polite and treat me the way I had been accustomed to being treated in higher ed. Not that that was always fine either, but it was better than many environments.
Yeah.
So I just want to point out those are lessons of learning about yourself and having humility about not getting it right all the time, those are the big lessons for me. The business model, which I think is important, is most consulting engagements at an individual level, let's say you or maybe you and a couple other people are doing something as opposed to a big engagement by a big firm. Typically what you are looking at is there's two different ways that the business model works. You either work on and it could be a per diem, it could be a per hour basis. And then you have to kind of estimate often how many days or how many hours that's going to take and give an approximation, and maybe sometimes stay within a margin of error. But, you can, if they're willing, you can try it on an hourly, or often with consulting, it can be a day basis or a half day. If you're doing like a training program, can be a per program basis. The other way that it's done is an intact fee, where for a fee, you will provide X amount of things and you manage it yourself. And that one, you really have to learn how to do that, because obviously if you underbid it, you will be doing it for free for quite a while. And having done all of those things, that's what you have to figure out, is a little bit about the market and how the market, and I know talking about the market isn't what psychology usually talks about, but you have to know your market to understand, and whether you're doing healthcare consultation or you're doing, wage and labor consultation, it doesn't really matter. You have to understand about where the rates are and how most organizations look at that. So the business model is, and this is where you have to be careful. For example, in my consultation, if I miss a flight someday and they say, "Thank you, Sandy, for waiting. I hope we weren't inconvenient." That, if I miss a flight and I miss my engagement, that could be half my month's salary. For example, if I'm doing something intensely, I have to be on site for something, I may lose half my month's salary. So you have to get used to, in the business model of a consulting firm, cash flow becomes a very critical issue. Now, I know in private practice and independent practice, cash flow is obviously a critical issue because you're waiting for payments. But consulting is often like that, only in bigger chunks. You might only have 15 different things you did and you're waiting for payments on them. And so the business model that you have to think about is, how much, what unit you're going to use to budget, whether it's a program, an hour, a project, whatever. And then within that, then how often you bill. Do you bill so much up front? Do you bill so much up front, something in the middle, and then hold out something for the end because the client has some leverage that way and feels better about it? So you have to think about all those things, because the cash flow is important. The missing your income periodically. I will tell you that cash flow is probably, and cash flow and focus are probably the two reasons that the average life of a consultant is about two years. What happens is somebody gets an initially really good project, they get involved in it, they do really good work, but they have spent no time while they're doing that one looking for other consulting work. So while you are doing existing projects, the business model has to be, you must always devote a little bit of your time to looking for other work. And it's probably good to not always look for it in the same place you're consulting currently, that you need a diversity of your portfolio of work. So the business model is always, do one or two, find another one, keep working on one or two, find another one. So you really always have to be reaching out, thinking about it. I got to tell you, I have not ever found that to be the most difficult part of the work. And the reason for that is not because I'm a great marketer. The reason for that is that I've always listened very carefully to what clients are telling me about what they need. And I always ask questions, is anybody else having the same problem you are?
Sure.
Or over time, if you have good clients and you do good work, they move to another organization and they call you. Or in my case, I affiliated with some institutions which had some built-in clients. Academic institutions, business schools have built-in clients other people are going after. So, I did not spend my life as the point person getting all the business. That does not inherently appeal to me. Some of my colleagues did that much better, and I supported them. So if they would find something, I would make sure I was a good number two person. My skill set, for example, I believe in the business model is I may not get in the door initially as easily as somebody else. And historically, that had a lot to do not just with how skilled I was, but it also had to do with the fact that I was a female. I might not get in the door as quickly as some of my male colleagues did, for example, my white male colleagues. But once I got in the door, I tended to have longer lasting relationships that kept sustaining work. So, I've had clients for 15 years, organizational clients that have kept me doing things with them for 15 or 20 years. So that's part of the business model too. Are you doing something just short term and circumscribed? So some people, for example, find a series of training programs they do and they just do it wherever you can do it, or a public offering of that and they do it wherever they can do it. Some people look for organizations where they can spend a little more time doing a greater variety of things. Those are all part of the business model.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Building on some of the things that you have already kind of spoken to and responding to both questions asked prior to the presentation, as well as it looks like we have a question in the Q&A section. I'm curious to, I guess, specifically hear a little bit more about the kind of branding aspect. So I'll read the question that one of our participants asked. When you were first starting as a consultant and may not have had quote unquote proof of your experience in serving as a consultant, how did you pitch your consultation services and knowledge base to potential clients?
Well, I started with what I knew best and what I was interested in. So I knew, for example, that on the healthcare side of things, for example, I knew I did a lot of work in stress and anxiety, for example. And so those were things that I knew I could work with. And I had done a lot of work with groups. And so I did a lot of my initial consultation work working with healthcare teams. I probably now worked in every unit of a hospital that you can imagine, trying to get teams of people to work together. And often I would be brought in as a result of, people will call it stress. Okay, so it's stress. Well, often stress turns into interpersonal communications or it turns into some other things. So I stayed pretty close to that. In my harassment work, for example, the sexual harassment, I knew something about organizational climate and I knew something about leadership and harassment. So I stayed very close in that. I did organized programs. I did consultations. I did some court work, in the legal system with it. So I stayed with things that I cared about and things that I felt fairly comfortable with initially. And then as I branched out, going to the Center for Creative Leadership, like I said, I was reading, you're reading or you're studying all the time. My curiosity has helped me tremendously in my life because I will always say, well, I wonder what that's about over there. So then I read up for a while, then I go and I try to study or read a book or work with a colleague and ask, tell me more about that. And, being willing to try, not doing things that I don't think I can do at all, but talking with colleagues who seem to do something different than I do and figuring out how they do it and how I might be able to add that in. That's been the constant, I think, thread of my work. But I would start close to home with something that you're fairly comfortable with in your daily life now. And just because there's enough discomfort going into a different environment under a different model to make that work initially, you don't have to change everything at once. It depends how adventurous adventurous you are, how curious you are, how risk averse you are or aren't. But that's what my career went completely from local to regional to national to global. And it progressed. And I think if I'd started in any other order, I would have been much less effective.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you again for speaking to that too. I'm aware of the times, and I have one more thing that I would love for you to speak through based on questions that we received. And then as I'm asking this next question and you're responding, I want to encourage if any of the participants who are still on the call have questions that they want to be sure that we address. Maybe we have time for one or two more. So please feel free to kind of submit those through the Q&A. But before we transition to other folks' Q&A, I also want to give space for you to share any ethical considerations that you would want people to keep in mind. I'm thinking of like kind of broad ethical considerations, but also thinking about like licensure pieces and just kind of how all of that plays out as you think about your role as a consultant.
Well, if I figure that out, I could help psychology tremendously. Some of these things are really difficult. You know, yeah. I'm practicing in India, but I am not allowed to practice in Indiana. You know, it's really, it's a little bit difficult. Depends what you're doing, and it depends the state that you're doing it in. First of all, this ties back to the other question about what proof did I have when I started. I think we get so credential oriented. I think what you have to think about is what do I know, or what knowledge or what tools do I have that I might be able to apply to this problem. And if the problem or the challenge is something that I think I'm missing some tools about, who else do I know that could help with this problem? And those two questions can take me into most any organization that I'm in. I don't worry about my credentials. I tell people that I work in the area of human behavior. Now, over time, my areas of specialty are leadership and organizational development and, diversity initiatives and things like that. I can say that over time, but I don't worry about telling them 10 or 15 things or credentials that I have. I look at what the core training I have is, and I value that. And that's easier said than done. And I want to say that with due humility. I didn't always have that wonderful attitude about it, but that's what it really comes down to. People don't need to see your shingle. What they need to see is, do you have something that would help me do better? That's all that most people want. Is there anything you know how to do or can teach me how to do that will help me be better, do better, think better, feel better? That's really all that there is about that. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to lose that perspective. From an ethical perspective, the first question, and there's another book I would recommend there, and it's one by Rodney Lohman and Stuart Cooper, who is a counseling psychologist. That's called The Ethics of Consulting Psychology, and it's a good primer. All of the people that do consulting would tell you that almost every issue you get into starts with some variation on who was the client. And that's the core of most consulting issues, because just like there are boundary issues in counseling with individuals, with families, with kids, etc., the boundary issues about who owns an issue, who owns data, what is confidentiality, what it can't be, it can be, who you work for, all of those things are around what are you there to do, who are you serving, and who is a client. And you may have actually two clients at the same time. You may be working with an individual, but you're being paid by the organization. So you want to get clear up front, for example, what that work consists of and what the confidentiality rules are. Because if you wait till later to do that, then you may have two different requests for information that don't look very similar in terms of confidentiality. So that's what I would say about the ethics piece of that, is probably read a case book and think about, in each of the situations when you walk in, it's like three-dimensional chess when you do organizational or team consulting. It adds just other layers of complexity to what you already know how to do, and you just have to keep them in your head at the same time and keep asking that question. Who is the client and how do I best serve that client? And then the second thing in the ethical range is, be prepared to consult. We all consult with each other regularly, because that's why you don't want to go into this solo. Organizations and teams are much bigger than any one person, and you can't keep everything in your head. So, Allie, what I would say is, consult, consult, consult. And that always helps you. Have any doubt about where you are, stop and ask a question. And that's kept me in good stead. As far as licensing goes, if you are not calling, that's one of the reasons I don't really worry about it that much. This is a very, there are two schools of thought on this. There's a school of thought that says if you're doing anything that looks remotely like a psychological process, you ought to be licensed to do it. A few states have that approach. Most other states, if you're licensed by title, if you're not calling yourself a psychologist, I can tell everybody I'm trained in psychology. I can say I'm a psychologist because I am licensed, but I don't have to be to do my work. I have colleagues I work with all the time who are not licensed, and what they will say is that they are trained in psychology and they bring psychological knowledge. They do not call themselves psychologists. So there's some discomfort with that sometimes. You might say, I was doing telepsychology 25 years ago because my clients are everywhere. If I wasn't able to talk with them by phone about their issues, they won't hire me. They don't want to see me in my office. They want to see me, first of all, they want to see them in their office or their location or on the move or for 10 minutes or whatever. So that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. So if you're doing nothing but assessment, if you're doing a lot of testing, and either for selection purposes for people in organizations or for development, I do think there should be the presence of probably someone who is licensed as part of that because of the sophistication of the tools you might be using. Beyond that, it's a very vague area.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's really fascinating to think about. I appreciate you both giving the resource and kind of talking through the different considerations. So I'm also aware of the time and kind of want to honor everyone's time. It looks like we haven't gotten other questions. So I guess at this point I want to transition to check in with you, Dr. Shulman. Was there anything that you wanted to be sure to share that you haven't had the chance to share yet? And then I'll kind of do some of the wrap up. And there may not be. I'm always hesitant to just kind of automatically go to the wrap up without giving a moment for pause.
No, I think I would just want to say, don't be afraid to try. The training that you've had already, for many of you, you're already in your first or second jobs doing something, or you've just come out of a training program, or you're in your internship or whatever. The training that you have is so much more advanced in the context of doing everyday life than most of the people that you're going to be working with if you stay focused on what you know, which is things about human behavior, development, diversity and inclusion, problem solving, communications. If you stay in those areas and then you study the context that you want to get into, in other words, if you want to get into working in businesses, then there are things to learn about the legal issues, the business, the market issues. You learn those. If you make a commitment to that based on a respect for what they do, you have a lot of things coming in that you already have, and not to feel like you have to wait 50 years to try to figure that out. And I'm happy to help anybody individually to think through, what they may want to do. And boy, I sure hope this was helpful.
Yes, immensely. I do. Thank you. I really want to pause and just share my gratitude. I'm imagining also on behalf of the participants as well. Thank you for sharing your journey and for sharing the kind of feedback and reflections on folks who are on this call who maybe are thinking about building a consultation practice. I think the resources and the perspective is really helpful. So I appreciate that. I also just want to throw out there for folks in general, as a reminder, these videos are recorded and they will be on the Division 17 website. So if you want to re-listen to it or kind of pass it along to a colleague that you know who's interested in learning more who wasn't able to attend, please make sure that they're aware that these recordings will be available on our website. So I think that's all. The ECP committee is always thinking about different topics that we can address during these webinars. So if you have any feedback about this webinar, or if you want to suggest ideas for future webinars, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear those thoughts too. So, and thank you again, Dr. Shulman, for sharing your experiences.
my absolute pleasure, and I just wish you all the very best in your careers.
Thank you.